When I was 16, my mom took me camping in the mountains and left me there. I'm Isabella, and the night my childhood ended didn't look dramatic at first. It was just cold air, the smell of smoke, and my mom shoving a cheap multi-tool into my hand. "Go grab some real firewood," she said. "Not that damp junk by the campsite. Time for you to learn how to take care of yourself." I returned to find the campsite gone and the SUV taillights fading. My mom's voice echoed, "If she wants to survive, she'll figure it out." Have you ever been attested by someone who was supposed to protect you? Let me know your story down in the comments. 6 years later, the smell of wood smoke has been replaced by the scent of expensive espresso and crisp blueprints. I'm a rising architect in one of the top firms in Boston, and my world is built on lines that are straight and budgets that are balanced. I like it that way. There is no room for ambiguity in structural integrity. Angela walked in on a Tuesday afternoon. She looked older, her hair shot through with gray, her thinner shoulders slumped. She didn't belong in a space this clean. She started sobbing the moment our eyes met, reaching out for a hug as if the last 6 years were just a minor misunderstanding. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't even stand up. Looking at her didn't trigger a breakdown, it triggered a mental audit. I realized then that my relationship with her had never been a bond of love, it had been a bad investment. I'd been the silent investor in her version of family, and she had overdrafted on my compassion for far too long. "Emily, Isabella," she choked out, her hand trembling as she clutched a napkin like a lifeline. "I've been looking for you for years. I made a terrible mistake on that camping trip." I leaned back in my chair, tapping a fountain pen against my mahogany desk. The sound was rhythmic and clinical. She wasn't my mother anymore. She was just a liability standing on my high-grade office carpet. I didn't ask her why she left me. I didn't ask her how she found me. Those were emotional questions, and I was strictly focused on the balance sheet now. I reached for the intercom on my desk, my finger hovering over the button with lethal precision. "You need to leave," I said. My voice was a flat line. No anger. No noise. Just facts. She gasped, her face crumbling further in front of the glass walls of my office. "You can't mean that. I'm your mother. We can start over." "No," I corrected her, my tone as cold as the Maine air. "You were a subscription I canceled 6 years ago." Now I realized it had been a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill. I pressed the intercom button. "Front desk? I have an unauthorized intruder in my office. Please send security to escort her out immediately." She stood there in shock, her hysterical sobs dying down as the realization hit. She wasn't shocked by what she had done to me when I was 16. She was shocked that I had stopped playing along. Security arrived in less than 60 seconds. As they led her away, her protests echoing down the hallway and bouncing off the marble floors, I didn't watch her go. I went back to my blueprints. I had a foundation to build, and for the first time in my life, it was going to be solid. The office fell silent again, the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system returning to its baseline. I looked down at the mahogany surface of my desk. I didn't feel the rush of victory. I felt the cold precision of a mental audit. To understand why I didn't flinch when she cried, you have to understand those 72 hours on the island. My mother calls it a test. I call it the day I realized I was an asset being written off. The Maine coast is beautiful in brochures, but it is lethal when you are 16 and abandoned. I spent 3 days drinking rainwater and counting granola bar crumbs like they were gold coins. While I was shivering under a cheap plastic poncho, Angela and David weren't searching for me. They were back in the city, using my disappearance as a strategic smokescreen. My late grandfather, Julian, had left a trust fund specifically for my education, $170,000. It was intended to be my structural foundation. But that week, they told the bank I was a runaway. They sat at their dining table and forged my signature on document after document. By the time I was rescued by a passing boat, the accounts had been harvested. My future had been liquidated to fund their illusions. People often ask why I stayed silent for so long after I came home. They don't understand the invisible chain of a survivor. For years, I had been conditioned to believe that my value was zero, a concept known as learned helplessness. It is a psychological prison where the walls are built out of your own forced compliance. I wasn't being weak, I was being tactical. In that environment, silence was the only way to keep my head above water. I had to endure their cruelty just to reach the age where I could finally walk away. My compliance wasn't a choice, it was a survival mechanism. I spent the next 6 years as the silent investor in their version of a perfect family. I watched that stolen money by my golden child brother, Tyler, a brand new truck while I worked 3 shifts at a diner to pay for community college. I lived in a studio apartment where the heat was a luxury I couldn't always afford, while they toasted to their own success with my inheritance. But survival is a strategic rebirth. Every floor I scrubbed, every blueprint I stayed up until 4 in the morning to finish, was a brick in a foundation they could never touch. I wasn't just building a career, I was performing a forensic audit on my own life. By the time Angela walked into my office today, she wasn't facing a daughter. She was facing a woman who had finally balanced the books. After security dragged Angela out, I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out a small, heavy box, the only piece of my past I had not thrown away. Inside sat that cheap multi-tool Angela had shoved into my hand on the island. It was rusted now, a piece of plastic junk that looked pathetic and out of place against my polished mahogany desk. I remember the second night on that island. The cold Maine air was thick, and I was trying to find a landmark to retrace my steps. I kept staring at the tiny compass built into the handle of that tool. I followed it for hours, pushing through thick, wet brush, only to find myself back at the same jagged rock formation every single time. At 16, I thought I was just stupid. I thought my fear was making me read the needle wrong or that my brain was simply too weak to understand the wilderness. But then, my fingers brushed against a small, unnatural bump on the back of the plastic casing. I used the dull blade of the tool to pry it open. Taped behind the dial was a tiny, high-powered magnet. The magnet was positioned perfectly to pull the needle just enough to the east to ensure I would walk in circles until I collapsed. It was a calculated adjustment designed to keep me wandering in the dark while the clock ran out on my future. It was never a test of survival. My mother had not left me there to learn how to be strong. She had left me there with a rigged map and a broken promise. She intended for me to stay lost just long enough to finalize the forged paperwork and drain my grandfather Julian's $170,000 trust fund. If I had died out there, it would have been a tragic accident. If I stayed lost for a week, it would have given her and David enough time to launder the money through their fake accounts. Discovering the magnet did not make me cry. It made me analytical. For years, I had lived in the shadow of the invisible chain, believing that my value was zero because they had treated me as disposable. I had spent my life performing a learned helplessness that they had carefully engineered. But as I stared at that rigged compass in my Boston office, the chain finally snapped. This was no longer a family drama, it was a criminal enterprise. My father, David, and my mother, Angela, were not just toxic parents, they were predators who had selected their own child as their primary target. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and I was done footing the bill. I looked at the needle now, spinning uselessly under the influence of the magnet I had never removed. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. It was the cold precision of an architect identifying a fatal flaw in a building's foundation. I realized then that I had been the silent investor in their version of a family for too long. I didn't need an apology, and I didn't need to ask why anymore. Facts do not have feelings, and neither does a forensic audit. I closed the box and went back to my computer screen. This was not revenge. This was accounting, and the house of cards they had built on my stolen legacy was about to face a total structural collapse. Angela didn't leave quietly. By Wednesday, my professional LinkedIn, my personal Instagram, and even my firm's Google reviews were flooded. She posted a grainy photo of us from before the island trip, a picture of a happy family that never actually existed. Success turns children into monsters, she wrote in a post that was shared 200 times by dinner. It was a classic narcissistic move, weaponize the public's ignorance to hide her own theft. My brother, Tyler, the one who never had to drink island mud to survive, sent a flurry of texts that buzzed against my nightstand like a swarm of angry hornets. "Mom is in the hospital because of you," he wrote. "She has a weak heart from the stress you've caused. Just pay back the $170,000 and we can be a family again." The irony was staggering. He was demanding I pay them back the money they had already stolen from me. I didn't reply to a single one. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. I went back to my spreadsheet. I looked at the comments on her posts. Strangers were calling me an ungrateful monster. This is the trap of ruthless normalization. To Angela, her cruelty was not a crime, it was just discipline. She had spent years normalizing the idea that her children existed to serve her needs. By framing her theft as family support and my survival as ungratefulness, she was using a mechanism that explains why some families can be toxic for decades without seeing their own reflection. It provides a socio-psychological perspective to explain the behavior of the antagonists, turning anger into an aha moment of understanding. She wasn't just a mother, she was the architect of a psychological prison where she was always the saint and I was always the debtor. 2 days later, at a high-end professional networking gala at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, they appeared. David was wearing a cheap suit and a pained expression. Angela was draped in a black dress and the very pearls my grandfather Julian had intended for my graduation, another symbolic theft. They cornered me near the marble staircase, speaking loud enough for the senior partners to hear. "Isabella, your father is having health issues," Angela hissed, her voice a theatrical whisper that carried across the room. "How can you stand here in a $3,000 dress while your family is falling apart?" I looked at her, then at David. I didn't see a dying man. I saw a man who had helped forge my signature to fund his son's vanity car. I didn't feel the need to defend my character. Character is built on a foundation of truth, not a performance of victimhood. I sipped my drink, my hand steady. "This isn't a family reunion, Angela. It's a public relations stunt. And you're losing the audience." I didn't run. I didn't hide. I simply walked over to the museum's security team and pointed them out as unauthorized guests. They were removed before the main course was even served. As the door closed behind them, I felt a sense of lethal precision. I had already called the forensic accountants. The gaslight parade was over. The clinical audit of their crimes was about to begin. The gala incident was the final social tremor before the structural collapse. I didn't spend another minute on emotional responses. I shifted entirely to the professional escalation. I hired a team of forensic accountants and a private investigator who specialized in high-stakes asset recovery. I wasn't looking for a mother's love anymore. I was performing a clinical forensic audit on a series of criminal twists. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and now, I was calling in the debt. The audit wasn't just about finding the money, it was about identifying the rot in the foundation. It took the experts less than a week to find the trail. They discovered a paper trail leading directly to a shell company named David's Coastal Construction. It was a textbook criminal twist designed to hide the theft. The company had no office, no employees, and no history of building anything other than a wall of lies. Every penny of my grandfather Julian's $170,000 had been cycled through this entity. The money had been liquidated to fund Tyler's new car and a lifestyle of vanity investments that Angela used to maintain her social facade. But the most lethal discovery came from the private investigator's search of David's old physical business files. Hidden inside a ledger for the fake construction company was a small, yellowed slip of paper, a purchase receipt from a specialized hobby shop, dated 3 days before the island trip. It was for one modified survival multi-tool. In the notes section, in Angela's sharp, unmistakable handwriting, she had specifically requested the shop owner to offset the magnetic alignment of the compass for a survival training prank. She hadn't just left me there with a broken tool, she had paid extra to ensure I would be led in circles. It was a secondary twist that removed the final layer of my hesitation. They hadn't just been toxic, they had been predatory. This was no longer a family drama, it was a criminal twist involving systematic fraud and attempted reckless endangerment. The receipt proved the island abandonment wasn't a lesson, it was a calculated attempt to keep me lost while they harvested my future. I stared at the digitized copies of the receipt on my office screen. The light from the monitor felt clinical, like a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts and numbers. Anger wasn't a scream anymore, it was a blueprint for a power flip climax. I didn't need to ask why they did it. The criminal twist was right there on the balance sheet. I was the silent investor who had finally taken control of the board. I forwarded the entire dossier to my lawyers and the district attorney's office. I didn't call Angela. I didn't text Tyler. I simply went back to my architectural models. In my world, a structure built on a faulty foundation eventually falls. I was just accelerating the timeline for their total execution of judgment. The gala for the Architectural Excellence Awards was the setting for my power flip climax. The room was a sea of black ties and silk, smelling of expensive lilies and the kind of social ambition my mother had always craved. I stood at the center, not as the 16-year-old girl who was abandoned on a Maine island, but as the woman whose structures were now defined as the future of the city. Then, the doors opened. Angela and David entered like a pair of unauthorized intruders, in a building they couldn't afford to lease. They had a local news crew in tow, playing the grieving parents card for the cameras. Angela rushed toward me, her eyes red and her hands outstretched for a hug she hadn't earned. "Isabella," she cried loud enough for the reporters to hear. "Please. We're losing everything, we just want our daughter back." I didn't step back. I didn't let my expression flicker. I looked at her with the cold curiosity of an architect identifying a structural failure. This was her last attempt to force a payout by weaponizing public shame. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a thick, white envelope. The cameras zoomed in, expecting a reconciliation check. I saw the greed flash in Angela's eyes, the same hunger I saw when they were counting my grandfather Julian's $170,000. "I have something for you," I said. My voice wasn't a scream, it was a finalized contract. As she took the envelope, I saw her ego begin to fray. This is the illusion of power from an empty wallet. People like Angela and David build their entire identity on a rental shell of status bought with stolen assets. Their power isn't internal, it's an external accessory. Once the forensic audit freezes those assets, the ego doesn't just bruise, it collapses completely because they have no inner value to stand on. Without the money, they don't have a personality, they only have a deficit. Angela tore the envelope open. Her face didn't find a check. It found a criminal indictment and an asset freezing notice for all their accounts, including the shell company they used to launder my inheritance. The color didn't just leave her face, it liquidated. She looked at the reporters, then at me, her mouth working like a faulty mechanism. "What is this? You can't do this. We're your family." I leaned in, my voice low enough for only her and the microphone on her lapel to catch. "No. You were a bad debt, I just settled." I took a step back, my posture a perfect vertical line. "I figured it out, Angela. I survived your lessons on that island. I survived the cold, the hunger, and the magnet you hid behind the compass." I looked her dead in the eye while the cameras rolled. "Now, it's your turn. Survive mine." I turned my back on them and walked to the stage to accept my award. I didn't hear her cries or the sound of security escorting them out. All I heard was the sound of a balanced ledger. The execution of judgment was finally complete. The legal machinery moved with the same cold inevitability as a wrecking ball. Angela and David were convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The $170,000 they harvested was ordered back as restitution, plus interest. Every asset they owned was liquidated to settle the debt. Tyler's truck, the stolen pearls, the house with the perfectly manicured lawn, it was all sold to balance the accounts. I didn't visit them in court. I didn't need to hear their final excuses or watch their desperate performances of regret. In my world, the structural analysis was complete. The building was down, and the site was finally clear of the rot. David is facing 3 years in state prison. Angela is facing 5. It isn't a family tragedy, it is a standard foreclosure on a life built on bad debt. I spent my next vacation on a quiet beach in Maine. Not the island where they left me, but a place I chose for myself. The salt air was sharp, and the sound of the Atlantic was constant and rhythmic. It was a far more honest sound than any conversation I had ever had with my family. I stood on the rocks and pulled out the rusted multi-tool. I looked at the compass one last time. It was a faulty mechanism from a faulty era. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt the same detachment I feel when I reject a flawed blueprint. I held it in my palm, feeling the weight of the past. Then, I closed my hand and tossed it far into the deep, gray water. I watched it disappear into the surf without a trace. The accounting was officially closed. The silence of the island 6 years ago was a terrifying vacuum. But the silence now is different. It is a silence I designed. It is a silence built on structural integrity and the truth. It is mine. True revenge is building a life they can never touch. If you're building yours right now, subscribe to join our community. Share this story to remind someone that the mountains don't have to be the end.